The morning mist clung to the kunai grass like a shroud as Private First Class Daniel McCarthy pressed his cheek against the stock of his Browning automatic rifle, watching the tree line 400 yards distant on the island of Bougainville. November the 7th, 1943, 0530 hours, 22 years old, a former factory worker from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. McCarthy had been in the Pacific for 8 months and had fired his bar in anger exactly 3 times during training exercises back at Camp Pendleton. His squad leader, Sergeant William Hayes, had told him the weapon was designed to provide suppressive fire during advances, laying down covering fire while riflemen maneuvered. Nobody had explained what to do when 600 Japanese soldiers came screaming out of the jungle in a human wave attack designed to overwhelm American positions through sheer numbers and psychological shock. The M1918A2 Browning automatic rifle weighed 19.5 pounds, fully loaded, firing 30-06 Springfield rounds from a 20-round magazine at a cyclic rate of up to 600 rounds per minute on its fast setting, 350 on slow. It compared to the M1 Garand's 8-round capacity and semi-automatic fire, or the bolt-action Springfield's 5 rounds. The BA represented the heaviest sustained firepower available to a Marine rifle squad, but McCarthy's training had emphasized fire discipline and ammunition conservation. Each magazine held only 20 rounds, and a bar gunner typically carried 12 magazines, giving him 240 rounds total. At 600 rounds per minute, he could empty his entire ammunition supply in 24 seconds of continuous fire. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Captain Robert Morrison had positioned his company along the western perimeter of the Marine beachhead, defending the approaches to a supply dump that contained ammunition, medical supplies, and rations for the entire 3rd Marine Division. Intelligence reports from native scouts indicated Japanese forces were massing in the interior jungle, preparing for a major counterattack designed to push the Americans back into the sea. Morrison's company numbered 163 Marines, depleted from their authorized strength of 211 by casualties from the initial landing and tropical diseases that had already hospitalized 48 men. Against them, Japanese commanders had assembled elements of the 23rd Infantry Regiment, approximately 800 soldiers who had been ordered to recapture the beachhead at any cost. The tactical situation reflected a broader strategic reality that defined combat operations throughout the Solomon Islands campaign. American forces possessed overwhelming advantages in firepower, logistics, and air support, but Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized aggressive night attacks and close combat that could neutralize those advantages. Banzai charges, the mass infantry assaults that had terrorized Allied forces across the Pacific, represented the ultimate expression of Japanese military philosophy. Soldiers were taught that spiritual strength and willingness to sacrifice could overcome material disadvantages, that the shock of human wave attacks would break enemy morale before superior firepower could inflict decisive casualties. McCarthy had been awake for 36 hours straight, taking his turn on watch, while other members of his squad caught brief intervals of sleep in the fighting holes they had dug during the previous afternoon. The defensive position was crude by textbook standards, a shallow depression, barely 3 feet deep, reinforced with logs cut from coconut palms and sandbags filled with volcanic sand. His assistant, Private Tommy Chen, a 19-year-old from San Francisco, whose parents had been interned in California while their son fought for the country that imprisoned them, crouched beside him with spare magazines laid out in careful rows. The first indication of the coming assault arrived not as sound, but as silence. The normal cacophony of jungle noises, the insects and night birds that created a constant background hum, suddenly ceased. McCarthy felt the hair on his neck rise, a primal response to danger that needed no conscious analysis. Sergeant Hayes moved through the position in a low crouch, whispering orders that passed from hole to hole like a chain of whispered prayers. Fix bayonets. Check your ammunition. Nobody fires until I give the word. The Japanese preparatory bombardment began at 05:45, a brief but intense barrage from 75mm mountain guns positioned in the ridges above the American perimeter. Shells whistled overhead and detonated among the supply dumps behind the forward positions, sending geysers of sand and debris into the pre-dawn darkness. The bombardment lasted exactly 4 minutes, time to suppress defending fire during the critical moments when attacking infantry would cross open ground. Morrison recognized the pattern from intelligence briefings. The shells were falling behind his positions, not on them, suggesting the Japanese either lacked accurate range data or were deliberately avoiding their own troops' assault routes. The first wave of Japanese infantry emerged from the jungle at 05:49, moving in a dense formation that stretched for 300 yards along the entire length of Morrison's defensive sector. McCarthy counted at least 200 men in the initial assault, possibly more concealed by the morning mist and shadows. They advanced at a steady jog, not the wild sprint of a Banzai charge, but the disciplined movement of veteran infantry who understood the importance of maintaining formation. Their rifles, the Type 38 Arisaka, were equipped with the characteristic long bayonets that added an additional 16 inches to the weapon's length, turning each soldier into a human spear. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamada led the assault from the center of the formation, his gunto sword raised above his head in the traditional posture of Japanese officers leading charges. At 28 years old, Yamada was a veteran of campaigns in China and the Dutch East Indies, a professional soldier who had risen through the ranks to command Charlie Company of the 23rd Infantry. His orders were explicit and allowed no room for interpretation. The American beachhead must be destroyed before dawn, when enemy aircraft would make any daylight attack suicidal. Speed and shock were essential. His men must reach the American positions before defensive fire could decimate their ranks. Sergeant Hayes held his fire, waiting as the Japanese formation closed the distance to 300 yards, then 250. McCarthy's finger rested on the trigger of his bar, feeling the weapon's weight solid against his shoulder. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, despite his efforts to control it, adrenaline flooding his system with the chemical precursors of fight or flight. Around him, other Marines maintained their positions with the discipline that months of training had instilled, fingers on triggers, eyes fixed on the approaching enemy. At 200 yards, Hayes gave the order. The entire Marine line erupted in simultaneous fire, 60 riflemen and 4 bar gunners opening up with everything they had. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous roar that seemed to tear the air itself. McCarthy pressed the trigger and felt the bar come alive in his hands, the weapon's recoil pushing back against his shoulder as it cycled through its 20-round magazine in less than 3 seconds. The tracers arced across the killing field like malevolent fireflies, marking the path of rounds that struck Japanese soldiers with devastating effect. The .36 Springfield cartridge, fired by the BR, delivered a bullet weighing 150 grains at a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second, generating kinetic energy of 2,700 foot-pounds at the muzzle. At 200 yards, that energy remained sufficient to penetrate multiple human bodies, the bullets passing through one soldier and striking those behind him. The Japanese formation, packed tight for mutual support and psychological reinforcement, became a liability as bar rounds carved through their ranks like scythes through wheat. McCarthy changed magazines with practiced efficiency, his hands moving through the sequence that had been drilled into muscle memory during countless training sessions. Release the empty magazine, retrieve a fresh one from the row Chen had prepared, insert it into the magazine well, pull the charging handle to chamber the first round, resume firing. The entire process took less than 4 seconds. But those 4 seconds felt like an eternity as Japanese soldiers closed the distance to 150 yards. The defensive doctrine that governed American infantry tactics in the Pacific had been developed through painful experience in earlier campaigns across Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and the Central Solomons. Marine commanders had learned that Japanese Banzai charges succeeded only when they achieved surprise or caught defenders in unprepared positions. Against entrenched Marines with clear fields of fire and adequate ammunition, the human wave attacks became exercises in systematic slaughter that inflicted catastrophic casualties on attacking forces while sustaining minimal friendly losses. But doctrine was one thing, and the reality of 600 screaming Japanese soldiers charging through morning mist was quite another. Private Chen fumbled a magazine, his hands shaking as he watched the enemy formation absorb casualties that would have broken any Western army, but barely seemed to slow the Japanese advance. Bodies lay scattered across the killing field, some still moving, others motionless in the characteristic sprawled postures of violent death. But for every soldier who fell, 3 more continued forward, their battle cries rising to a crescendo that competed with the roar of American weapons. McCarthy's bar jammed on his 4th magazine, a failure to feed caused by a combination of dirt, moisture, and the weapon's high rate of fire. He performed immediate action without conscious thought, pulling back the charging handle to clear the malfunction while Chen loaded a fresh magazine. The jam had cost him perhaps 5 seconds, but in those 5 seconds, the Japanese advance had closed to 100 yards. He could see individual faces now, young men not much different from himself except for the circumstances that had placed them on opposite sides of industrial warfare. The American M1 Garand rifles created a steady percussion that punctuated the deeper roar of the bar weapons, each rifle firing its distinctive 8-round clip at a rate limited only by how fast the shooter could acquire targets and squeeze the trigger. The Springfield bolt actions, carried by Marines who had not yet been issued the newer semi-automatic weapons, added their own sharp reports to the symphony of destruction. Together, the combined firepower of Morrison's company was delivering approximately 15,000 rounds per minute into the Japanese formation, a volume of fire that no amount of courage or determination could overcome. Lieutenant Yamada died somewhere around the 100-yard mark, struck by multiple rounds that lifted him off his feet and spun his body like a rag doll before dropping it, face down, in the volcanic sand. His death went unnoticed by the soldiers who followed him, men whose training had prepared them for this moment through years of indoctrination, emphasizing duty, honor, and sacrifice. They had been taught that death in service to the emperor was the highest possible achievement, that to die in battle was to enter Yasukuni Shrine, where the spirits of fallen warriors received eternal veneration. What their training had not prepared them for was the systematic efficiency of American defensive firepower. The bar weapons, positioned at intervals along the Marine line to provide overlapping fields of fire, were functioning exactly as their designer, John Moses Browning, had intended. Each gunner was covering a sector approximately 80 yards wide, traversing their weapon in controlled bursts that swept across the Japanese formation like invisible scythes. When combined with the concentrated fire from M1 Garands and Springfield rifles, the defensive line created a wall of lead that transformed courage into futility. McCarthy changed magazines for the 6th time, his hands now moving with mechanical precision despite the chaos around him. Spent brass casings littered the bottom of his fighting hole, creating a golden carpet that crunched beneath his knees. The bar's barrel had become hot enough that heat waves shimmered in his peripheral vision, but the weapon's design allowed for sustained fire that would have melted lesser guns. Chen was feeding him magazines in steady rhythm now, having overcome his initial terror to function with the professional competence that training had instilled. The first Japanese soldier reached the Marine perimeter at 0557, having covered 400 yards under continuous fire that had killed or wounded 80% of his company. Private James O'Connor, positioned 15 yards to McCarthy's left, fixed the bayonet and engaged in hand-to-hand combat that lasted perhaps 10 seconds before other Marines converged on the position and eliminated the threat with rifle butts and bayonets. The incident demonstrated both the extraordinary courage of Japanese infantry and the fundamental weakness of tactics that sacrificed mass for the sake of maintaining assault momentum. Captain Morrison monitored the battle from his command post, a fortified bunker that provided observation over the entire defensive sector while offering protection from artillery and small arms fire. His radio crackled with reports from platoon leaders, each confirming that defensive positions were holding. Despite the ferocity of the Japanese assault, the pre-positioned machine gun sections had not yet been committed to the fight, held in reserve against the possibility of follow-on attacks that intelligence suggested might follow the initial assault. Morrison understood that this was not a probe or a reconnaissance in force, but a full-scale attack designed to achieve breakthrough at any cost. The second wave of Japanese infantry emerged from the jungle at 0600 hours, 400 fresh soldiers who had waited in reserve while their comrades absorbed the initial defensive fire. These were men from Baker Company, 23rd Infantry, led by Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, a 32-year-old professional officer who had watched the destruction of the first wave from an observation post 300 yards behind the assault line. Tanaka recognized that frontal assault across open ground had failed, but his orders allowed no flexibility for tactical innovation. He would lead his men forward and achieve breakthroughs or die in the attempt, because those were the only outcomes that Japanese military doctrine considered acceptable. McCarthy had fired 8 magazines, 160 rounds, in the 11 minutes since Hayes had given the order to commence firing. His shoulder ached from the bar's recoil, and his ears rang with a high-pitched whine that blocked out everything except the loudest sounds. He watched the second wave of Japanese soldiers advance across ground that was now littered with the bodies of their comrades, and he experienced a moment of cognitive dissonance that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. These were human beings, men with families and histories and futures that were being systematically erased by weapons that reduced courage to irrelevance. But the moment passed, and his training reasserted control. He changed magazines and resumed firing, traversing his bar across the new targets that presented themselves with the mechanical efficiency of a factory worker performing familiar tasks. The weapon bucked against his shoulder with each burst, 3 to 5 rounds at a time, aimed at the center mass of soldiers who seemed to materialize from the morning mist like ghosts seeking violent resurrection. The WWII's effectiveness in defensive operations stemmed from its unique position in the hierarchy of American infantry weapons. Too light to serve as a true machine gun, it nevertheless provided sustained automatic fire that exceeded anything a rifleman could achieve with semi-automatic or bolt-action weapons. The M1919 Browning machine gun, water-cooled and crew-served, could deliver heavier volumes of fire, but its weight and complexity made it less flexible for the fluid tactical situations that characterized Pacific warfare. The BR represented a compromise, accepting reduced ammunition capacity and relatively light barrel construction in exchange for portability and individual operation. Private Chen was down to his last 3 magazines when Sergeant Hayes appeared at their position, carrying an ammunition can that held 8 fresh magazines. The sergeant's face was blackened by powder smoke, and blood from a shrapnel wound on his left arm had soaked through his uniform sleeve. He dumped the magazines into their fighting hole and moved on without speaking, continuing his rounds through the defensive positions to redistribute ammunition and assess casualties. His presence provided reassurance that transcended words, the physical manifestation of a leadership that kept frightened men fighting when every instinct screamed for flight. The tactical reality that Captain Tanaka confronted as he led Baker Company forward was fundamentally different from what Lieutenant Yamada had faced 11 minutes earlier. The ground was now obstructed by bodies and wounded men, creating obstacles that forced his soldiers to slow their advance and pick their way through the carnage. Worse, the American defenders had refined their fire discipline, understanding now the timing and rhythm required to maximize the BR's effectiveness while conserving ammunition for sustained engagement. McCarthy could see individual Japanese officers urging their men forward, recognizable by their swords and the white headbands that marked them as leaders. He deliberately targeted these officers, understanding that their deaths would degrade unit cohesion and command control. The BR's accuracy at ranges under 300 yards made such selective targeting possible, each burst of 3 to 5 rounds guided by sights that had been zeroed during pre-deployment training exercises back in California. At 0609, the Japanese assault reached its high-water mark, a point approximately 75 yards from the marine perimeter, where the cumulative effects of sustained defensive fire finally exceeded the attackers' ability to maintain momentum. Soldiers began seeking cover behind fallen logs and natural depressions in the terrain, transforming from assault troops into suppressed targets who could neither advance nor retreat. This was the moment Morrison had been waiting for, the transition from defensive fire to offensive action that would transform tactical success into strategic victory. He ordered his reserve platoon forward, 40 Marines who had waited in secondary positions while their comrades absorbed the initial assault. These men advanced in fire teams, providing mutual support while systematically eliminating Japanese soldiers who had gone to ground. The BR gunners shifted their fire to suppress enemy positions, allowing riflemen to close and eliminate resistance with grenades and small arms fire. The evolution from defense to attack took less than 5 minutes, but those 5 minutes completed the transformation of a Japanese assault into comprehensive defeat. Private First Class Daniel McCarthy would later struggle to articulate what he experienced during those 90 minutes of sustained combat. The official after-action report would record that his squad had fired approximately 420 rounds of .36 ammunition, changed magazines 21 times, and achieved an estimated 43 enemy casualties directly attributable to his bar fire. But numbers could not capture the psychological weight of systematic killing, the accumulation of individual deaths into a collective catastrophe that challenged every assumption about warfare and human courage. The silence that followed the battle was more profound than the noise that had preceded it, broken only by the moans of wounded men and the distant calls of jungle birds resuming their interrupted routines. Sergeant Major Kenzo Watanabe had observed the assault from a forward command post, positioned on a ridge overlooking the American defensive perimeter. At 41 years old, he was among the oldest non-commissioned officers in the 23rd Infantry Regiment, a career soldier who had enlisted in 1920 and participated in the Manchurian Campaign, the invasion of China, and the conquest of the Philippines. His 23 years of military service had taught him to recognize defeat when he saw it, and what he witnessed through his binoculars during those 90 minutes represented catastrophic failure on a scale that challenged his understanding of modern warfare. The bodies of 600 Japanese soldiers lay scattered across 400 yards of volcanic sand and kunai grass, creating a tableau of destruction that defied the calculations underpinning Japanese tactical doctrine. The regiment's intelligence officer had estimated American defensive strength at approximately 150 Marines, armed with standard infantry weapons that included rifles, machine guns, and automatic weapons. Those estimates had been accurate. What they had failed to predict was the devastating effectiveness of weapons that could deliver sustained automatic fire with accuracy that exceeded anything the Japanese arsenal could match. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Watanabe's radio crackled with reports from company commanders attempting to account for their scattered units. Charlie Company reported 63% casualties, with both the company commander and executive officer killed during the initial assault. Baker Company's casualty rate exceeded 70%. Their formation shattered by defensive fire that had caught them in the open during their advance across ground already littered with bodies from the first wave. Dog Company, held in reserve for the anticipated breakthrough exploitation, remained at full strength but would never receive the orders to advance because no breakthrough had occurred. The ammunition expenditure required to achieve this defensive victory revealed the fundamental disparity between American and Japanese logistical capabilities. McCarthy's squad alone had fired over 400 rounds of .30-06 ammunition, with similar consumption rates recorded across Morrison's entire company. The Marines had expended approximately 40,000 rounds of rifle and automatic weapons ammunition during 90 minutes of sustained combat, a volume of fire that would have exhausted the entire ammunition supply available to a Japanese infantry company for a month of operations. American logistics in the Pacific operated on a scale that Japanese planners found difficult to comprehend. Each Marine division required approximately 1,500 tons of supplies daily, delivered by cargo ships that traveled protected convoy routes from rear area bases in Australia and New Zealand. Ammunition represented only a fraction of this total, supplemented by food, medical supplies, fuel, spare parts, and the 1,000 other items necessary to sustain modern military operations in hostile environments. The supply dumps that Morrison's company had defended contained sufficient stores to support division operations for 2 weeks, guarded by forces that represented less than 1% of total division strength. By contrast, Japanese forces on Bougainville operated at the end of supply lines that had been progressively degraded by American naval and air superiority throughout the Solomon Islands campaign. Ships attempting to deliver supplies faced submarine attacks and airstrikes that sank more vessels than successfully completed their voyages. The 23rd Infantry Regiment had been on half rations since arriving on the island 3 months earlier, with soldiers subsisting on rice, supplemented by whatever food they could gather from the jungle. Ammunition allocations reflected similar constraints, with riflemen typically carrying only 60 rounds, less than a third of the standard American load. Private Yoshiro Tanaka had survived the assault by taking cover behind the body of his squad leader, remaining motionless for 40 minutes while American fire swept over his position. At 19 years old, he was among the youngest soldiers in his platoon, a draftee from rural Kyushu who had completed basic training only 6 months before deployment to the Pacific. His Arisaka rifle lay somewhere in the killing field, abandoned when a bar burst had struck the soldier beside him and sprayed Tanaka with blood and tissue fragments. He would eventually crawl back to Japanese lines after darkness fell, one of fewer than 200 survivors from the 600 men who had participated in the assault. The psychological impact of the defeat spread through Japanese positions like a contagion that no amount of military discipline could contain. Soldiers who had witnessed this systematic destruction of assault waves began questioning the tactical doctrines that had sent their comrades to pointless deaths. Officers struggled to maintain morale among men whose confidence in their leadership had been shattered by orders that achieved nothing except the elimination of experienced combat veterans who could not be replaced. Colonel Hiroshi Matsuda, commanding the 23rd Infantry Regiment, received preliminary casualty reports at 0730 hours and immediately understood that his regiment had effectively ceased to exist as a combat-effective force. The 600 casualties represented more than half his available infantry strength, with disproportionate losses among non-commissioned officers and junior leaders whose experience held units together during combat operations. The survivors were scattered, disorganized, and psychologically traumatized by exposure to firepower that had transformed courage into liability. The tactical lessons that emerged from this engagement would reshape Japanese defensive strategy throughout the remainder of the Pacific War, though not in ways that could alter the ultimate outcome. Imperial General Headquarters began emphasizing entrenchment and prepared defensive positions over offensive operations, recognizing that American firepower superiority made assault tactics suicidal. But this defensive shift merely delayed inevitable defeat rather than preventing it, because American industrial capacity could produce the ammunition, weapons, and supplies necessary to reduce any defensive position through systematic application of overwhelming force. Captain Morrison conducted his battlefield assessment at 0800 hours, walking through positions that had held against odds that should have been overwhelming. His casualties totaled 9 killed and 23 wounded, a remarkably favorable exchange ratio that validated every aspect of American defensive doctrine. The WWII weapons had performed exactly as designed, providing sustained automatic fire that multiplied the effectiveness of conventional rifles while remaining mobile enough for individual operation. Private First Class McCarthy sat in his fighting hole, mechanically cleaning his bar with the solvent and patches from his maintenance kit. His hands moved through familiar motions that required no conscious thought, while his mind struggled to process what he had experienced. The official count attributed 43 enemy casualties to his fire, though such precision seemed absurd when bodies lay stacked in overlapping heaps that made individual identification impossible. He had fired 420 rounds in 90 minutes, each trigger pull representing a conscious decision to end human life, and the accumulated weight of those decisions felt heavier than any physical burden. Corporal James Washington, the company's senior BR gunner with 14 months of Pacific combat experience, moved through the positions checking weapons and redistributing ammunition. At 24 years old, the former Detroit auto worker had developed a professional competence with the BR that made him the informal mentor for newer gunners like McCarthy. He paused at McCarthy's position and examined the weapon with the critical eye of a craftsman assessing tools. The bar showed evidence of sustained fire, its barrel darkened by heat and powder residue, but mechanically sound and capable of continued operation. Washington noted approvingly that McCarthy had maintained fire discipline despite the chaos, avoiding the common mistake of burning through ammunition in long, undisciplined bursts. The weapon's selector switch showed wear consistent with proper use, alternating between slow and fast rates of fire to balance firepower against ammunition consumption. The bipod legs, often removed by Marines seeking to reduce weight, remained attached and showed scrape marks, indicating McCarthy had used them to stabilize his fire. The Japanese wounded presented Morrison with ethical and practical challenges that had no clear doctrinal solutions. Approximately 80 enemy soldiers lay scattered across the battlefield in various states of injury, some calling for help in Japanese, others silent and motionless, except for the shallow breathing that indicated life. American military policy required providing medical treatment to wounded enemies after securing the battlefield. But Morrison's company had only 2 Navy corpsmen and limited medical supplies. The wounded Japanese would require resources that might be needed for American casualties in future engagements. He ordered his corpsmen to conduct triage, treating the most seriously wounded first regardless of nationality, while armed Marines maintained security. The decision reflected both military necessity and personal morality, but it created tensions among Marines who had watched those same enemies trying to kill them 90 minutes earlier. Several soldiers questioned why American medical supplies should treat men who would return to combat if they recovered, though most understood that such decisions separated professional soldiers from savages. Intelligence specialists arrived at 0900 hours to conduct tactical questioning of prisoners through interpreters. The captured Japanese soldiers, 23 men whose wounds prevented escape during the American counterattack, provided insights into enemy strength, disposition, and morale that would prove valuable for future operations. Several prisoners expressed surprise at receiving medical treatment, having been taught that Americans tortured and executed captured soldiers. The cognitive dissonance between propaganda and reality created psychological effects that transcended immediate tactical considerations. Private Tanaka, interrogated through a Nisei interpreter who had volunteered for military service despite his family's internment, described the regiment's supply situation with a frankness that suggested complete psychological defeat. His unit had been on reduced rations for 3 months, with soldiers suffering from malnutrition and tropical diseases that had not been adequately treated due to lack of medical supplies. The assault had been ordered by division headquarters against the recommendations of regimental officers who understood that success required artillery support and coordinated attacks that their limited resources could not sustain. The Nisei interpreter, Private First Class George Yamamoto, conducted the questioning with professional detachment that concealed complex emotions about interrogating soldiers who shared his ethnic heritage. His parents remained imprisoned at Manzanar internment camp in California while their son served in the U.S. Marine Corps, a paradox that exemplified the loyalties and identities that defined the Pacific War. Yamamoto's fluent Japanese and cultural understanding made him invaluable for intelligence work, but also subjected him to suspicion from Marines who questioned whether someone of Japanese ancestry could be trusted in combat against Japan. The strategic implications of the engagement extended beyond immediate tactical results to affect American planning for subsequent operations throughout the Solomon Islands and beyond. The decisive defeat of Japanese assault tactics validated doctrinal emphasis on firepower and defensive preparation, while demonstrating that American forces could achieve favorable casualty ratios even when outnumbered. These lessons would influence operations from Tarawa to Iwo Jima, shaping the island-hopping campaign that would eventually bring American forces to the Japanese home islands. Sergeant Major Watanabe drafted his after-action report in the command bunker, choosing words carefully to convey tactical realities without explicitly criticizing the decisions that had led to disaster. Japanese military culture did not tolerate criticism of superior officers, and frank assessment of tactical failure could result in severe punishment for the messenger. He wrote that American defensive positions had proven stronger than anticipated, that enemy firepower had exceeded intelligence estimates, and that future operations would require different approaches. The report omitted any mention that assault tactics had been fundamentally flawed, that courage could not overcome technological superiority, or that continuing such attacks would accomplish nothing except the systematic elimination of Japan's remaining combat-effective infantry. Colonel Matsuda understood what Watanabe's carefully worded report actually meant. The 23rd Infantry Regiment had been destroyed as an effective fighting force, its combat power degraded below the threshold necessary for offensive operations. The survivors were scattered, demoralized, and psychologically traumatized by exposure to firepower that had transformed battlefield courage into meaningless gesture. Rebuilding would require months of rest, retraining, and replacement of casualties that Japan's strained manpower resources could no longer provide. The ammunition expenditure that had achieved this defensive victory represented less than 2 days of routine supply for Morrison's company. American logistics could sustain such consumption rates indefinitely, delivering ammunition faster than infantry could fire it while simultaneously supplying food, medical care, and equipment that maintained fighting effectiveness. Japanese forces lacked equivalent logistical capacity and would progressively weaken as the campaign continued, unable to replace losses or maintain supply levels necessary for sustained operations. Private McCarthy spent the afternoon of November 7th helping bury the dead, a task that required 3 platoons working shifts to enter bodies that were already decomposing in the tropical heat. The Marines buried their own with individual graves marked by dog tags and crude wooden crosses, while Japanese dead were placed in mass graves that would be properly marked for future identification. The work was physically and emotionally exhausting, handling bodies that had been violently killed and were now swelling and discolored in the heat. He found Lieutenant Yamada's body lying face down, with the officer's sword still clutched in his right hand, the blade bent from impact with the ground. The sword represented centuries of Japanese military tradition, each fold of the steel embodying craftsmanship and warrior spirit that dated to the samurai era. McCarthy felt an unexpected moment of respect for an enemy who had died leading his men forward despite facing overwhelming odds. He placed the sword beside Yamada's body before the burial detail covered the remains with volcanic sand. The captured Japanese weapons provided tangible evidence of the material disparities that defined Pacific combat. The Arisaka Type 38 rifle was a well-crafted bolt-action weapon that reflected excellent Japanese manufacturing quality. But its design dated to 1907 and lacked the semi-automatic capability of the M1 Garand. Japanese soldiers firing Arisakas could achieve perhaps 15 aimed shots per minute under ideal conditions, compared to 40 rounds per minute from a Garand and sustained automatic fire from the bar. This 3-to-1 disparity in rate of fire translated directly into combat effectiveness that no amount of training or courage could overcome. The Type 96 light machine gun, Japan's squad-level automatic weapon, weighed 23 pounds and fired the same 6.5mm cartridge as the Arisaka rifle from a 30-round magazine. American ordnance specialists who examined captured examples noted sophisticated design features, including a quick-change barrel and adjustable rate of fire, But the weapon's lighter cartridge delivered significantly less kinetic energy than the 36-round fired by American weapons, reducing effective range and penetration. More critically, Japanese squads typically carried only one light machine gun compared to American squads that included both a bar and access to heavier M1919 machine guns at platoon level. The psychological aftermath of the battle manifested in ways that military medical officers were only beginning to understand. Several Marines who had performed effectively during combat developed tremors, insomnia, and anxiety symptoms in the days following the engagement. These were not physical wounds, but psychological injuries inflicted by exposure to violence that exceeded normal human experience. Navy psychiatrists would later classify such responses as combat fatigue, though the condition would not be formally recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. For another 3 decades, Private Chen, McCarthy's assistant gunner, developed a hand tremor that made fine motor control difficult and prevented him from effectively handling ammunition. The corpsman diagnosed combat exhaustion and recommended evacuation to a rear area hospital, but Chen refused to leave his squad. He continued performing his duties with degraded effectiveness until the tremor gradually subsided over subsequent weeks, though nightmares about the battle would persist for years afterward. The Japanese survivors faced different psychological challenges. Soldiers who retreated from battle violated deeply ingrained cultural norms that emphasized death before dishonor, creating shame that transcended military failure. Several survivors attempted suicide in the days following the battle, choosing death over the disgrace of having survived when their comrades had perished. Officers struggled to maintain discipline among men whose fundamental beliefs about warfare and honor had been shattered by exposure to American firepower that made traditional military values seem obsolete. Private Tanaka, recovering from his wounds in an American field hospital, experienced cognitive dissonance that challenged everything his military training had taught him. He had been instructed that Americans were weak, decadent, and incapable of matching Japanese fighting spirit. The reality he had witnessed contradicted those teachings so completely that he found himself questioning other aspects of the propaganda he had been fed. The Americans had treated his wounds, provided food, and handled prisoners with basic human dignity that contradicted descriptions of barbaric enemies who tortured captured soldiers. The strategic situation on Bougainville evolved rapidly in the weeks following November 7th. Japanese forces withdrew to defensive positions in the island's interior, abandoning offensive operations that had proven futile against American firepower superiority. The 23rd Infantry Regiment, reduced to 40% of authorized strength, consolidated survivors into composite units that bore little resemblance to the formations that had assaulted the Marine perimeter. Colonel Matsuda was relieved of command in December and assigned to administrative duties in Rabaul. His career effectively ended by the failed assault. American forces expanded their perimeter and improved defensive positions, while engineers constructed airfields that would support bomber operations against Rabaul and other Japanese strongholds throughout the region. The beachhead that Morrison's company had defended became a major logistics base, supporting division operations across the northern Solomon Islands. The supply dumps that had been threatened on November 7th grew to contain thousands of tons of ammunition, food, and equipment that enabled sustained offensive operations. The BR weapons that had proven so effective in defensive combat would serve American forces throughout the remainder of the Pacific War and beyond. The basic design that John Moses Browning had created in 1917 proved adaptable to conditions ranging from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the frozen mountains of Korea. Modifications improved reliability and reduced weight, but the fundamental concept remained unchanged. A single soldier with a BR could deliver firepower that exceeded anything possible with bolt action or semi-automatic rifles, providing infantry squads with organic automatic weapons that did not require crew operation. Private First Class Daniel McCarthy would carry his bar through subsequent campaigns, including Guam and Iwo Jima, accumulating combat experience that transformed him from frightened replacement into competent professional. He survived the war and returned to Pittsburgh, where he worked in a steel mill until retirement in 1983. He rarely spoke about his experiences, except to other veterans who understood what he had seen and done. The bar he had carried through 3 amphibious assaults was eventually donated to a military museum, where it remains on display with a placard describing its role in Pacific combat. The mass grave containing Lieutenant Yamada and his soldiers would be located and exhumed by Japanese recovery teams in 1952, their remains repatriated for burial in Yasukuni Shrine. Yamada's sword, preserved by the Marine who had found it and eventually returned to his family through post-war correspondence, became a family heirloom representing both the courage of those who had fought and the futility of tactics that had sacrificed lives to no strategic purpose. The engagement, on November 7th, 1943, represented in microcosm the broader dynamics that would determine the Pacific War's outcome. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized spirit and sacrifice, values that had proven effective against less prepared opponents in earlier campaigns. American doctrine emphasized firepower and logistics, the systematic application of industrial capacity to military problems. When these contrasting philosophies collided, the results were tragically predictable. 600 Japanese soldiers died attempting to recapture a beachhead defended by 163 Marines, achieving nothing except their own destruction. 9 Marines died defending that position, their sacrifice meaningful because it contributed to strategic objectives that would eventually bring the war to Japan's home islands. The disparity in casualties reflected not differences in courage or fighting spirit, but fundamental realities about industrial warfare in the 20th century. The BR weapons that had proven so decisive remained in American service until 1957, when they were finally replaced by more modern designs. But their legacy extended far beyond their service life, influencing automatic rifle development throughout the Cold War and establishing doctrinal principles about infantry. Firepower that remained relevant in contemporary military operations. The weapon that had stopped 600 Japanese soldiers in 90 minutes had proven John Moses Browning's genius for designing firearms that balanced firepower, reliability, and portability in ways that changed warfare itself. The volcanic sand and kunai grass eventually reclaimed the killing field where McCarthy had fired 420 rounds into attacking Japanese formations. Tropical vegetation obscured the mass graves and fighting positions, transforming the battlefield into jungle that showed no evidence of the violence it had witnessed. But the lessons learned on November 7th, 1943, would echo through subsequent decades of military history, taught to generations of soldiers studying the relationship between firepower, tactics, and the human cost of warfare. I thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.